What if a shepherd boy from a small settlement on the Tiber River could reshape the entire world? What if 7 hills held the destiny of millions? Welcome to Dreamtime History. Part 1. The Murmur of Destiny, from Shepherd Settlement to Republic of Legends. Imagine stepping into the year 753 BCE. The Latium plain spreads beneath a merciless Mediterranean sun, a landscape neither particularly fertile nor strategically obvious. Here, where the Tiber River bends in its winding journey toward the sea, a handful of Latin tribes have established ramshackle settlements on 7 low hills. If you had lived in such a place, you would have needed to adapt quickly to the harsh realities of frontier existence. Constant vigilance against rival tribes, the ability to cultivate marginal land, and the psychological resilience to accept that your small community might never become more than it was. You would have learned to kill without hesitation, to negotiate without weakness, and to understand that survival demanded you reshape yourself into something harder, sharper, more pragmatic than your ancestors. These people are not merchants of extraordinary cunning, not scholars of towering intellect, not warriors of legendary ferocity. They are practical, sometimes brutal, occasionally visionary, but above all, they are survivors with an almost pathological need to build something permanent. The founding myth whispers of Romulus and Remus, twin infants cast into the Tiber, rescued by a she-wolf, and raised to remember that they were destined for greatness. Whether literal or symbolic, this myth contains a profound truth. Rome would always be a civilization born from the violent displacement of what came before. The original inhabitants, Etruscans to the north, various Latin and Sabine tribes scattered across the hills, would be absorbed, conquered, or assimilated into something new. Rome, from its genesis, understood that transformation through conquest was not merely permissible, it was inevitable, even sacred. By the 6th century BCE, Rome had begun its metamorphosis from a collection of villages into a proper city-state, and this transition was neither smooth nor bloodless. The Tarquin kings ruled, and under their reign, the city acquired its first real infrastructure. The drain system that would become the Cloaca Maxima, those subterranean rivers of stone that would flow beneath Roman streets for 2 millennia, temples that rivaled those in more established Greek colonies, and walls that announced to the world in no uncertain terms, "We are no longer incidental." These walls spoke a language that neighboring powers could understand, the language of permanence, of ambition, of refusal to remain peripheral. But kingship, as it so often does in the tragic narrative of human power, bred contempt. The story of Lucretia, a noblewoman violated by Sextus Tarquinius, the son of the reigning king, became the spark that would ignite a revolution. Her violation was not merely a personal tragedy, it was a violation of Rome's emerging sense of justice and order. When Lucretia took her own life rather than live with the shame, something awakened in the Roman breast. It was not mercy. It was not gentleness. It was rage channeled into purpose. Around 509 BCE, driven by the need for change, Rome cast off its kings and created something unprecedented, a republic. This moment, the rejection of kingship, contains a secret that echoes through all of Roman history. Rome's true genius was never in the brilliance of a single leader, though Rome would produce many brilliant leaders. It was not in the physical prowess of its soldiers, though Rome would field armies that seemed almost supernatural in their discipline. Rome's authentic stroke of genius was this: it understood that power distributed is power sustained. The Republic created the Senate, a body of aristocrats called patricians who would collectively hold authority, deliberate in the marble halls they constructed, and create laws that would bind even themselves. Yet the story of the Republic is not a story of harmony. It is a story of tension, of struggle, of the eternal Roman conflict between ambition and duty, between the individual and the state. The patricians held power, but the plebeians, the common people, the laborers, the farmers, gradually demanded representation. This was not a gift granted from above. It was a right seized from below. Through strikes, through violence, through the sheer weight of numbers, the plebeians forced their way into political life. By the 3rd century BCE, the conflict of the orders had resolved itself into a complex system where both patrician and plebeian shared authority, creating a delicate equilibrium that held Rome together even as it tore itself apart. It was during this period of internal struggle that Rome began to look outward. The Italian peninsula was not one unified space. It was a patchwork of city-states, kingdoms, and tribal territories. Rome, through a combination of military might, diplomatic cunning, and the strategic use of roads and fortifications, began to absorb these territories one by one, not as conquered peoples to be enslaved, but as allies, as junior partners in a system that Rome called its confederacy. This was the secret of Roman expansion. It offered something to those it conquered. It offered order. It offered the protection of Roman legions. It offered the possibility of Roman citizenship, a prize so valuable that men would abandon their ancestral homes to achieve it. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome faced its greatest challenge yet, Carthage. This was not a small rival city-state. Carthage was a naval superpower, a merchant empire that controlled the western Mediterranean with an iron grip. It was wealthy beyond measure. Its ships moved spices and goods across seas that Rome had barely ventured to explore, and its general Hannibal would soon become the most feared name in the Roman world. The Punic Wars, 3 brutal conflicts spanning over a century, would test Rome's very foundations. In the Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BCE, Hannibal did something that seemed impossible. He crossed the Alps with war elephants and an army of mercenaries from across North Africa, and he descended upon Italy like a biblical plague. At the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, he destroyed a Roman army of over 50,000 soldiers. The ground was so saturated with blood that the earth itself seemed to weep. Rome's enemies thought this was the end. They thought Rome would crumble, that this upstart city on the Tiber had finally met its match. But Rome did not crumble. Instead, it did something that revealed the core of its character. It refused to accept defeat as final. The Romans, under the leadership of Scipio Africanus, regrouped, adapted their tactics, and eventually defeated Hannibal not in Italy but in Africa itself. When Hannibal finally fell in battle, it was not because Rome was stronger. It was because Rome was more stubborn, more willing to sacrifice, more determined to transform setback into eventual victory. These wars transformed Rome fundamentally. They expanded Roman territory across the Mediterranean. They enriched Rome with the wealth of conquered peoples. But they also filled Rome with something more dangerous than wealth: confidence. Rome had defeated the greatest military mind of the age. Rome had proven that its system of distributed power, its legions of citizen soldiers, its willingness to incorporate conquered peoples, this Roman way was superior. The Republic, now stretched from Spain to Syria, began to believe in its own invulnerability. This belief would prove to be both Rome's greatest strength and its eventual undoing. Part 2. The Blood of Ambition. The Republic's Descent into Civil War. By the 1st century BCE, The Roman Republic was a magnificent facade concealing a profound rotting at its core. The Senate still met. Laws were still debated. The machinery of governance continued its motions. But the spirit that had animated the Republic, that delicate balance between ambition and duty, was dying. What was replacing it was something far more primal: the hunger for individual power. The century began with the Social War, 91 to 88 BCE, a conflict that pitted Rome against its own Italian allies who demanded the full rights of Roman citizenship. The irony was brutal. Rome had built an empire on the promise of incorporating conquered peoples, yet when those people demanded the very status they were promised, Rome responded with legions and bloodshed. It took a catastrophic war to force Rome to grant what should have been granted willingly. But the social war was merely a prelude to a far greater convulsion. As the Republic struggled with this internal crisis, a figure emerged from the shadows of Roman politics who would come to embody the new Rome, a Rome ruled not by laws but by men. His name was Pompey the Great, and he was exactly what the ancient world feared: a general so successful, so beloved by his troops, so magnified by military victory that he began to believe he was above the constraints of law. Pompey conquered the Levant, subdued pirates, and brought vast territories under Roman control. When he returned to Rome, he expected to be treated as Rome's savior. Instead, the Senate, jealously guarding its collective power, refused to grant him the honors he demanded. Wounded pride and political frustration gestated in Pompey's heart like poison in a wound. Then, in 60 BCE, something remarkable happened. 3 men, Pompey, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Crassus, Rome's richest citizen, formed what history would call the First Triumvirate, though it was not an official position. It was a secret alliance, a conspiracy of the powerful to circumvent the Senate and remake Rome according to their collective vision. This triumvirate was not a partnership of equals. It was a temporal arrangement between predators who recognized they could accomplish more together than separately. Julius Caesar would emerge as the dominant figure in this unholy trinity, though no one could have predicted it when the alliance formed. Caesar was not particularly wealthy. He was not, at that time, particularly powerful. What Caesar possessed was something rarer and more dangerous. He possessed an almost preternatural understanding of human nature. He could inspire loyalty in his soldiers that bordered on religious devotion. He could charm senators with words that seemed to contain hidden meanings. He could read the currents of power flowing through Rome's political landscape as if they were written in his own flesh. In 59 BCE, using his connections with Pompey and Crassus, Caesar was elected consul. Then, in a move that revealed his true ambition, he maneuvered himself into the position of governor of Gaul, a vast territory of the Celtic peoples north of Italy, a land of forests and tribes and untamed peoples. Most senators thought this was exile, a way to get Caesar out of Rome. They did not understand that Caesar was positioning himself for something far greater. The Gallic Wars, 58 to 50 BCE, transformed Caesar into something the world had never quite seen before: a general who was also a propagandist. He wrote accounts of his campaigns himself, framing his military victories not merely as conquests but as necessary steps in bringing civilization to barbaric peoples. His words, distributed throughout Rome, created an image of Caesar as Rome's greatest military mind. Senators back in Rome read his dispatches and felt the weight of his growing power like pressure building before a storm. Caesar conquered Gaul. He brought vast territories and immense wealth into Rome's orbit. He made himself indispensable. But more importantly, he made himself irreplaceable in the minds of his soldiers. A Roman legion's primary loyalty was supposed to be to Rome itself, to the Republic, to the abstract idea of civic duty. Caesar changed this equation. His soldiers loved him. They would have followed him into Hades itself if he had commanded it. When Caesar attempted to return to Rome, the Senate, now dominated by Pompey and the faction opposed to Caesar's growing power, demanded that he disband his armies before entering the city. This was the law. This was the tradition. This was how Rome maintained its system of distributed power. No general could bring an army into the sacred boundary of the city itself. To do so was treason. Caesar faced an impossible choice, or so it seemed. Disband his armies and face political ruin, possibly execution. Or keep his armies and march on Rome itself, transforming from general into tyrant in a single irrevocable act. In 49 BCE, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River, the boundary between Gaul and Italy, with his army intact. As he did so, he allegedly uttered words that would echo through history: "The die is cast." He was not asking for permission. He was announcing a fait accompli. The republic that had endured for 5 centuries was about to be shattered by a man who understood that power, once consolidated, could never be relinquished voluntarily. The civil war that followed was brief but devastating. Pompey, for all his military skill, was outmaneuvered by Caesar's superior tactics and the loyalty of Caesar's troops. After battles across the Mediterranean, Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was assassinated by minor functionaries hoping to curry favor with Caesar. Caesar pursued Pompey to Egypt, where he encountered Cleopatra, the young queen of Egypt, and their affair would produce a son and reshape Mediterranean politics. By 44 BCE, Caesar stood at the apex of power. The Senate granted him the title of Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. He was Caesar, Imperator, the man who had defeated all his enemies and united Rome under his personal rule. Senators wore purple-bordered togas. People literally bowed in his presence. Citizens carried his image on coins and clay tablets. He had transcended the realm of mortal men and entered the territory of gods. But power, once seized, generates enemies. Not all Romans had accepted Caesar's transformation of the Republic into a monarchy in all but name. Among those who opposed him were senators who had once been his friends, men who saw in Caesar's dictatorship the death of everything they believed Rome should be. Chief among these was Marcus Junius Brutus, whom Caesar loved as a son. On the Ides of March, the 15th day of March, in 44 BCE, Caesar attended a Senate meeting despite omens that seemed to warn of danger. His wife had begged him not to go. A soothsayer had warned him to beware the Ides of March. But Caesar, who had conquered nations and defeated every opponent, refused to show fear. He entered the Senate House. What happened next became one of history's most iconic moments. 23 senators, led by Brutus, surrounded Caesar. The knives came out. The blood spilled onto the marble floor. Caesar fell, stabbing and slashing, crying out in betrayal as the men he had called friends cut him down. His final words, "Et tu, Brute?" were not a question but a recognition of the ultimate betrayal. He had thought himself beyond the reach of mortal consequence. He had discovered too late that no man, no matter how great, is truly untouchable. The assassination of Caesar did not restore the Republic. Instead, it plunged Rome into another cycle of civil war. Caesar's allies, including his general Mark Antony, sought revenge. The Senate fractured into competing factions. A young man named Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir, emerged from relative obscurity and began with cunning and patience to consolidate power in the chaos. For 13 years, Rome tore itself apart. Armies clashed. Senators were executed. The streets of Rome ran red with the blood of civil conflict. Rome, which had conquered the world, could not seem to conquer itself. The Republic, that noble experiment in distributed power, was dying not from external conquest but from internal contradiction. A system designed to prevent the accumulation of power in a single man had, by the brutality of its own mechanics, created conditions that made such accumulation inevitable. By 31 BCE, Octavian had defeated all rivals. He controlled Rome's legions. He controlled the Senate, which no longer functioned as a deliberative body but as a rubber stamp for his decisions. He controlled the people, who were desperate for peace after generations of civil war. And in a masterful act of political theater, Octavian announced that he was restoring the Republic. This was a lie, though it was a beautiful and sophisticated lie. The Republic was not restored. Instead, it was transformed. Octavian took the title Augustus, the Exalted One, and created something new, the Roman Empire. He would rule as emperor, though he maintained the fiction that the Senate still held real power. He wore the trappings of a citizen rather than a monarch. He spoke of duty and service rather than kingship and command. But everyone understood the truth. Rome was no longer a republic. It was an empire. The age of shared power had ended. The age of a single man wielding supreme authority had begun. And though the republic was gone, the machinery of governance it had created would persist, adapted to serve not the many but the one. Part 3. The Eagle's Flight, the Empire Ascendant and its Golden Zenith. Augustus ruled for over 40 years, and in that time he transformed Rome from a war-torn republic into a stable, prosperous empire. He did not do this through the display of tyranny. Rather, he did it through the careful cultivation of legitimacy. He maintained the Senate. He consulted with aristocrats. He allowed debate within strictly defined bounds. He presented himself not as a monarch but as primus inter pares, first among equals, though the power differential was so vast that the appearance of equality was almost farcical. Augustus understood something that many rulers learned too late. Legitimate power is more durable than power seized by force alone. He created a civil service, trained administrators who would run the empire according to established procedures and laws. He reformed the military, creating a professional standing army of Roman citizens paid regular wages and serving fixed terms. He built infrastructure, roads that connected the empire, aqueducts that brought fresh water to cities, harbors that facilitated trade. And he understood the power of symbols. Augustus commissioned architects and poets to celebrate Rome's glory. The Era Pacis, the altar of peace, was constructed to commemorate his victories and the stability he had brought. Poets like Virgil and Horace composed epics celebrating Augustus as the restorer of order, as the man chosen by the gods to bring Rome into its golden age. Suetonius, the historian, recorded that Augustus claimed to have found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. This was hyperbole, but like all good propaganda, it contained an essential truth. Under Augustus, Rome experienced something close to universal peace for the first time in generations. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, spread across 3 continents. Trade flourished. Cities grew. The borders of the empire stabilized, and Roman legions stood guard against the barbarian peoples beyond. A merchant could travel from Britain to Egypt using Roman roads, sleeping in Roman inns, conducting business in Latin, and knowing that Roman law protected their interests. This was no small achievement. The successors of Augustus would not all be wise. Some were mediocre. Some were mad. But the institution Augustus created proved resilient. The empire endured through incompetent emperors because the system had become larger than any individual. The Senate, the bureaucracy, the military, these institutions had their own inertia and their own interest in preservation. The early empire saw the reign of Tiberius, Augustus's stepson, a man who was capable but increasingly paranoid as he aged. Then came Caligula, young, impulsive, eventually insane, squandering the wealth Augustus had accumulated and humiliating the Senate with his erratic behavior. But even Caligula's excesses did not destroy the empire. The system held. Claudius followed, an unlikely emperor, stuttering and physically awkward, whom many assumed was intellectually deficient. But Claudius surprised Rome by being a capable administrator and a military commander of considerable skill. He conquered Britain, expanding the empire's territory and demonstrating that Rome's appetite for conquest had not been sated by Augustus's pacification policies. Then came Nero, beautiful, talented, utterly unstable. Nero fancied himself an artist and a poet. He performed on stage, which scandalized the aristocracy who believed such behavior was beneath imperial dignity. He persecuted Christians, blaming them for a great fire that consumed Rome, fire that Nero himself may have set. And yet, even Nero's madness did not topple the empire. The Roman institutional framework had become so deeply embedded that individual incompetence at the top could not shake its foundations. After Nero's suicide, a succession of strong emperors took control. Vespasian, who had been a military commander, took power through civil war and immediately set about restoring stability. He began construction of the Colosseum, the great amphitheater that would stand as Rome's symbol for millennia. His son Titus completed it and used it to host games that entertained hundreds of thousands of Romans. The spectacles were beyond anything the world had ever seen. Mock naval battles in flooded arenas, fights between exotic animals captured from across the empire, gladiatorial combats that were simultaneously entertainment and execution. These games revealed something essential about Rome. It was a civilization that had achieved such material abundance that it could afford spectacle on an unprecedented scale. It could afford to build monuments that served no practical purpose except beauty. It could afford to house, clothe, and feed hundreds of thousands of slaves. Rome had not merely conquered the world. It had extracted the world's wealth for its own enjoyment. The reign of Trajan, 98 to 117 CE, marked the empire's territorial zenith. Trajan was a military man first and foremost, and he drove the empire's borders to their farthest extent, conquering Dacia, modern-day Romania, and pushing into Mesopotamia. The empire under Trajan stretched from Scotland to Iraq, from the Rhine and Danube to North Africa and Egypt. A territory so vast that a man could spend his entire life traveling within Roman borders without seeing the full extent of his homeland. But Trajan's conquest came at a cost. The military campaigns required enormous expenditures. The treasury, though vast, was not unlimited. And maintaining such an extended frontier required stationing legions across the empire, legions that could not be easily recalled without inviting invasion from Rome's enemies. Trajan's successor, Hadrian, understood a truth that military men often resist. There is wisdom in knowing when to stop. Hadrian withdrew from some of Trajan's more distant conquests and focused on consolidating Roman control over existing territories. He built Hadrian's Wall across northern Britain, a physical manifestation of empire's limits. He traveled throughout the empire, inspecting legions and administering justice. And he commissioned the construction of the Pantheon in Rome, a temple so perfectly designed that it seems to defy the architectural knowledge of its age. The reign of Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180 CE, represented something unique in Roman history. A philosopher-emperor, a man trained in Stoic philosophy who saw ruling as a duty rather than an opportunity for personal aggrandizement. Marcus Aurelius spent much of his reign fighting on the empire's frontiers, against Parthians in the east and Germanic tribes in the north. He endured hardship, disease, and the loss of loved ones. He filled his diary, later published as the Meditations, with reflections on duty, on accepting what cannot be changed, and on the proper use of power. What made Marcus Aurelius remarkable was not his military victories but his moral clarity. He understood that power was a responsibility, not a prize. He reformed Roman law to protect slaves. He established schools for orphans and the poor. He saw his role as serving Rome rather than exploiting it. In a civilization where emperors had often used their power for personal gratification, Marcus Aurelius stood as a counterexample. Yet even Marcus Aurelius could not arrest the slow decline that was beginning to creep across the empire. By the 3rd century CE, Rome faced simultaneous crises. The Parthian Empire pressed from the east, Germanic tribes pushed from the north, and internal instability, economic inflation, plague, and military mutinies threatened to tear the state apart. A succession of generals took the throne through military coup, each ruling for a few years before being assassinated by rivals. The empire seemed to be coming apart at its seams. Part 4. The Twilight of Eagles. The empire's long decline and its transformation. The crisis that gripped Rome in the 3rd century seemed, to many observers, to presage the end. How could an empire that had conquered the world, that had created a civilization of unparalleled sophistication, simply collapse? And yet, that is precisely what seemed to be happening. Economic collapse reduced the empire to a barter system. Military defeats allowed barbarian peoples to cross the frontier and settle within Roman territory. The Senate, stripped of real power centuries ago, was merely a ceremonial body. But Rome, as it had done so many times before, adapted. In 285 CE, Diocletian, a military man of considerable ability, took power and enacted reforms so sweeping that they essentially recreated the empire. He divided Rome into two halves, an Eastern Empire and a Western Empire, each with its own emperor, its own capital, its own administration. The Eastern Empire, centered on Constantinople, formerly Byzantium, would prove far more stable and longer-lasting than the Western Empire. Diocletian also initiated the persecution of Christians, a religious sect that had grown from a handful of believers to perhaps 1/10 of the empire's population. For over 2 centuries, Christians had existed in the margins of Roman society. They refused to participate in pagan religious ceremonies. They rejected the worship of the emperor as a god. They taught that all men, slave and free, rich and poor, were equal before God. This was dangerous theology in a hierarchical empire. But Christianity would not be suppressed. Instead, something remarkable happened. In 312 CE, Constantine, another military man who had seized power, converted to Christianity. Constantine claimed to have seen a vision of a cross in the sky before a crucial battle. and he interpreted this as a sign from the Christian God. Whether this vision was genuine or politically calculated remains unknown. What matters is that Constantine chose to align himself with Christianity rather than oppose it. Constantine founded Constantinople on the site of ancient Byzantium and made it the new capital of the empire. He legalized Christianity throughout the empire. Within a few generations, Christianity had transformed from a persecuted sect to the empire's official religion. The old gods, Jupiter, Venus, Mars, were abandoned. The temples built to honor them were converted to churches or left to crumble. Rome, the civilization that had been pagan for over 1,000 years, became Christian. This transformation reveals something fundamental about Rome. It was not ultimately a civilization devoted to any particular set of beliefs. Rome was a civilization devoted to order, to power, to the persistence of the state. If Christianity served those ends better than paganism, then Christianity would be adopted. Rome was pragmatic above all else. But even as Rome transformed itself, it was dying. The Western Roman Empire, centered in Italy, became increasingly difficult to govern. Military expenses depleted the treasury. Barbarian tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks, began to press across the frontiers with increasing boldness. In 410 CE, something that would have seemed impossible centuries earlier occurred. Rome itself was sacked. The Visigothic king Alaric led his army into the city, and for 3 days Rome was looted and burned. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Rome, which had built an empire through military conquest, found itself conquered. The eternal city, which was supposed to stand forever, was violated by barbarians. The news spread throughout the empire like a shock wave. If Rome could fall, what could not? The Western Roman Empire staggered on for another 60 years, but the writing was on the wall. Economic collapse, administrative chaos, and constant warfare with barbarian tribes made effective governance impossible. Roman legions, once the terror of the ancient world, became ragged and depleted. The great roads that connected the empire fell into disrepair. The cities that had been centers of Roman civilization were abandoned or reduced to shadows of their former glory. In 476 CE, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, a young man named Romulus Augustulus, ironically bearing the names of Rome's founder and its first emperor, was deposed by a Germanic warrior named Odoacer. There was no great battle, no climactic siege. Rome simply ceased to exist as a political entity. The machinery of government that had endured for over 1,000 years ground to a halt. Yet this was not the end of Rome. The Eastern Roman Empire, which would come to be known as the Byzantine Empire, endured for another 1,000 years. Constantinople remained a great city and the seat of imperial power. Roman law, Roman administrative practices, and Roman culture persisted in the East long after the West had fragmented into barbarian kingdoms. Moreover, Rome's legacy proved far more durable than Rome itself. The Roman language evolved into Italian, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. Roman law became the foundation for legal systems throughout Europe. Roman engineering, aqueducts, roads, concrete, set standards that would not be surpassed for over 1,000 years. Roman literature and philosophy influenced thought throughout the Middle Ages and into the modern era. The Catholic Church, which became the successor to Rome in many ways, inherited Rome's organizational structure and administrative practices. Popes in Rome claimed to be heirs of the Caesars, and in a sense they were right. Rome had transformed from a political empire into a spiritual one, its authority no longer enforced by legions but by faith. What makes Rome so endlessly fascinating is that it was not a civilization that remained static. It transformed itself repeatedly. It began as a republic, became an empire, encountered Christianity and became Christian, divided itself into two, and when it fell, its legacy persisted in transformed forms. Rome understood, perhaps better than any civilization before or since, that adaptation is the price of survival, and that power, rightly used, extends far beyond the lifetime of any individual or even any institution. The great amphitheaters Rome built still stand, crumbling but defiant. The roads it paved still carry travelers. The languages it spoke have evolved into modern tongues. The legal concepts it pioneered still govern our courts. Rome may have fallen in 476 CE, but Rome, in 1,000 transformed ways, never truly died. It lives in every Western city with a forum, every legal code derived from Roman law, every Romance language, every institutional hierarchy inherited from Roman administration. This is why Rome endures in human memory not merely as a historical curiosity but as a living presence. Rome represents humanity's capacity to build civilizations of staggering scale and complexity. It represents both our highest achievements and our deepest failures. It shows us that even empires that seem eternal can crumble, that even the greatest powers can fall, and that the legacy we leave behind often exceeds the monument we build. Rome was not a moment in history. Rome was a transformation of what civilization could be. And in that transformation, it made itself immortal. The eternal echo, Rome's cultural legacy and the immortality of civilizations. The marble statues stand in silence. The aqueducts no longer carry water through the countryside. The legions have disbanded. The Senate meets no more. Yet walk through any European city today and you will find Rome, not as ruins but as living breath in the very structures of civilization. Rome fell in 476 CE, but Rome never truly died. Instead, it transformed into something far more profound and enduring than any political empire could ever be. It became culture itself. Consider this. When you stand in a courtroom today, you are standing in Rome. The adversarial system of justice, the concept of presumption of innocence, the elaborate codes of law that protect both the powerful and the powerless, these are Rome's gifts to the modern world. If you had been a citizen living under Roman law, you would have understood something revolutionary for your time. That law was not the whim of a tyrant but a codified system that applied equally to all. You would have adapted to the idea that even emperors were theoretically bound by law, that justice could be appealed, that property rights existed independent of a ruler's mood. The Justinian Code, compiled in the 6th century as a comprehensive summary of Roman law, became the foundation upon which European legal systems were built. French law, Spanish law, Italian law, all descend directly from Roman jurisprudence. Even in nations that never fell under direct Roman rule, the fingerprints of Roman legal thinking shaped how justice was administered. But Rome's legacy extends far beyond the courtroom. The very language you speak carries Rome within it. If English borrowed approximately 60% of its vocabulary from Latin and Romance languages, then English is, in a profound sense, Rome speaking to the modern world across 2,000 years. When you use words like civility, or urban, or navigate, or democracy, you are speaking Latin. French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, these languages did not emerge spontaneously from the rubble of Rome. They evolved directly from the Latin that Roman soldiers, merchants, and administrators spoke as they moved through conquered territories. A child learning Spanish is, in a sense, learning the language of Caesar's legions filtered through centuries of transformation. The physical infrastructure Rome built still carries people and goods. Roman roads, constructed with such precision that some remain relatively intact after 2,000 years, set the standard for engineering that would not be surpassed until the modern era. The Roman arch, the Roman vault, the Roman dome. These architectural innovations allowed builders to span greater distances and enclose larger spaces than had ever been possible before. If you had been a medieval builder laboring to construct a cathedral, you would have needed to study Roman structures, to understand their principles, to adapt their techniques to your own era's needs. The engineering knowledge that made Rome possible did not disappear with Rome's political collapse. Instead, it persisted in buildings and texts, waiting to be rediscovered and reapplied by successive generations. Perhaps most remarkably, Rome bequeathed to the world not just structures and laws, but modes of thinking. The Roman historians, Livy, Tacitus, Suetonius, established traditions of historical writing that persist today. They taught that history was not merely the recording of events, but the interpretation and analysis of those events through the lens of moral and political meaning. They demonstrated that a historian's job was not simply to chronicle what happened, but to explain why it happened and what it meant. Roman philosophers like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius grappled with questions that remain relevant today. How should power be used ethically? What constitutes a good life? How should we respond to hardship and loss? If you had lived in the medieval monasteries of Europe, where monks painstakingly copied Roman texts by candlelight, you would have participated in one of history's greatest acts of cultural preservation. These monks, many of whom did not fully understand the Latin they were copying, understood on some deeper level that the knowledge contained in these texts was precious. They sacrificed comfort, sometimes their health, to preserve Rome's intellectual legacy. Without their dedication, most of Roman literature would have vanished. The church itself became Rome's greatest monument and its most enduring transformation. When Constantine converted to Christianity in the 4th century, he did not replace Rome. He Romanized Christianity. The church adopted Rome's hierarchical structure, its administrative divisions mirroring Rome's provincial system, its bishops ruling regions much as Roman governors had done before them. The Pope in Rome claimed to be the successor of Peter, but Peter's authority in Rome was defined through the language and frameworks Rome had created. If you had been a medieval peasant living in the shadow of a cathedral, you would have witnessed Rome's continuing power through the church's authority. The rituals performed in that cathedral followed patterns established in Roman temples. The hierarchies of the clergy mirrored the hierarchies of the Roman state. The Latin liturgy spoke to you in Rome's language. Rome had not merely survived through the church. Rome had merged with spirituality itself. But Rome's cultural legacy extended beyond the institutional and the linguistic. Roman art and architecture set aesthetic standards that would influence Western civilization for 2,000 years. The proportions of the Parthenon, the elegance of Roman portraiture, the sophistication of Roman mosaics. These artistic achievements were preserved, studied, and eventually revived during the Renaissance. Artists and architects of the 14th and 15th centuries looked back at Roman ruins and Roman texts with almost religious reverence. They sought to recover not just Rome's aesthetic principles but Rome's entire worldview. This was no nostalgic antiquarianism. It was a genuine belief that Rome represented the highest achievement of human civilization and that by recovering Rome's wisdom, the Renaissance could elevate itself above the medieval period that had preceded it. The very concept of civic identity that Rome pioneered continued to shape how humans organized themselves politically. The idea that individuals could be citizens of a larger entity, that citizenship conferred certain rights and duties, that loyalty to the state transcended loyalty to family or tribe, these are Roman inventions. When modern nation-states developed in Europe, they adopted this Roman framework. When democracies emerged, they drew on Roman models of republican government. When empires were built, British, French, Spanish, they explicitly modeled themselves on Rome, studying Roman administration to understand how to govern vast territories with diverse populations. Rome understood something that few civilizations have grasped, that cultural power can exceed political power, and that the legacy of ideas can outlast the legacy of military conquest. Rome's legions conquered territories, but Rome's language, law, and cultural frameworks conquered minds. They shaped how humans thought about justice, governance, beauty, and meaning. 2,000 years after Rome's political collapse, we live in a world that is profoundly Roman in its structure and assumptions. We may not realize it. We may think of ourselves as post-Roman, post-imperial, as having transcended the ancient world. But Rome lives in us, in our legal systems, our languages, our architectural preferences, our historical consciousness. This is the deepest truth about Rome. It was not ultimately about the empire or the emperors or the legions. It was about the creation of a coherent civilization, a way of organizing human society that was so elegant, so practical, and so intellectually rich that it could not be erased by mere political collapse. Rome fell, yes, but Rome's way of thinking, organizing, and creating persisted. It transformed, adapted, evolved, but it endured. And in that endurance lies a profound lesson, that civilizations are not measured by the permanence of their political institutions but by the depth of their cultural impact. Rome rules not through legions anymore, but through every courtroom, every language, every architectural principle inherited from its distant past. When you look at the ruins of Rome today, the Colosseum, the Forum, the Pantheon, you are not looking at the graves of a dead civilization. You are looking at the birthplace of our own. Rome did not end in 476 CE. Rome was reborn in every generation that chose to study it, learn from it, and build upon its foundations. Rome, in this sense, never truly fell. It merely transformed into the very fabric of the world that followed.